Okay, start. Welcome to this session considering mediation and some of the challenges and particular requirements of military families. I'm Karen Barham. I'm a consultant at Moore Barlow. I'm a solicitor who now practices exclusively as a mediator and parenting coordinator. I'm qualified to see children and I supervise about 30, I think it is 30 other mediators as a PPC. I'm a member of Resolution's DR committee and was a member of the early resolution subgroup to the Family Procedure Rule Committee that saw the changes to the NCDR rules of April 24. Gosh, we're almost 2 years into those. I now practice entirely away from the court, as many of us do, and Helen, and I'll introduce her. Our colleagues Liam and Charlotte are also mediators, but they continue to practice as lawyers. Liam is a chartered legal executive and a mediator. He is a member of Resolution and is at the firm Bolnack and Bishop, where he's been since July 2019. He deals with a wide range of family law matters. And I have to say, I think his particular speciality is in those matters and for families with a military element. He is the son of his father having served in the Navy, and this area is particularly of interest to him. And I think he'd said in one of our scoping meetings that about 80% of his work has a military aspect. Charlotte is an experienced family solicitor and accredited mediator, and she's now with Scott Bailey LLP. And I was delighted to work with Charlotte when she was at Moore Barlow, and our loss is certainly Scott Bailey's gain, with her having moved nearer to her home. She's passionate about helping families in a constructive way, and as I say, she spends her time practicing as a lawyer and a hybrid mediator. She has experience of mediating with military families in relation to finances and children arrangements, and again, her contributions today are invaluable. Helen it was previously a lawyer and now works exclusively as a mediator at Family Solutions with Claire Webb and Rebecca Hawkins and others who, of course, are enormous contributors in this space and great friends of the FMC. She's also the chief executive of Southampton Family Trust Building Relationships, and we are going to hear a little more about that. So welcome to this session. We are going to try and cover a great deal of ground, but I think it's probably important, and we're going to invite Helen to tell us what do we mean by military families and the context perhaps of some of their particular and unique needs and their challenges.
Brilliant. Thanks, Karen. So, Helen, other Helen, if you could share the slides, that would be great. Lovely. Thank you very much. So if we just pop through to the agenda. So just quickly, Karen's already covered the introductions, and we are just going to have a think about some of the practical sort of the context in which we might be mediating, and then some more detail around the financial aspects of mediating with military families and the emotional considerations as well. So if you could move on, please. Lovely, thank you. So just to understand, as Karen said, about the context that we will be working in as mediators when we work with military families. So, and for those mediators who are not already in the military family or not part of it or don't have partners in it, we're just going to give you some more insight into what it feels like to be part of a military family. So what do we mean by military families? Well, we mean anybody who is in the Royal Navy and Royal Marines, the British Army, or the Royal Air Force. And members of the armed forces community or military families will include regulars who are current members, reservists, veterans, who is anybody who served for at least one day in the regular or reserve forces, and then the family. So partners, dependents, and relatives living with or partnering with service personnel. So if you just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. It's important, I think, when we're mediating military families, really to understand the context that we are working in. So when one or both parties are part of a military family, the context is genuinely materially different. It really is a different way, a different life. Military families don't just experience separation as a private relationship breakdown, they experience it inside a system with its own rules, culture, power structures, and practical consequences involved in a breakdown. And I think if we miss that context, even the best mediation skills can fall short for our families. Next slide, please. Sorry to sound like Chris Whitty. Lovely, thank you. Um, so for mediators, it's really important, I just think, to understand that military service is like a total institution. It shapes where families live, how often they move, who controls housing, income stability, healthcare access, excuse me, and sometimes even daily routines. So, key features of military life might include frequent relocation, sometimes every 2 to 3 years. And then what comes with that is if you've got children, repeated school transitions, changing local services. So, if you have a child who has a plan at school, then you'd have to restart getting that plan every time you move school. So, lots and lots of sort of implications of the frequent relocation. Then you've got periods, obviously, of enforced separation, which will happen when the family is still living together, but obviously will continue now that the family have separated. So obviously that involves deployment, training, exercises, weekending, so people are away during the week and then come back at weekends. And really, people do have limited autonomy over where they're posted, when you get leave, and their availability. So really important just to understand that. Obviously, there's a strong hierarchy and chain of command. And in mediation, this might show up as one party, for example, maybe not feeling they've had equal power in the relationship, or maybe the non-serving spouse has made repeated career sacrifices. So, yeah, again, just lots of different contexts to think about. So sometimes what we might normally, if we're outside the military family, then we might think as a personal choice might actually have been structurally imposed. So just important to understand that. If you could move on, please, Helen. Thank you. So the other thing, obviously, is to remember separation often triggers multiple losses at once. So it can trigger really a series of cascading losses. And these may include loss of housing for the non-serving partner, loss of community and identity, loss of access to military support, the welfare or healthcare systems, and obviously a loss of financial predictability. So sometimes in mediation, emotions might be disproportionately intense, not because people are being uncooperative, but because they are grieving over sort of a cascade of personal losses at any one time. And we will talk about some of those issues later on. So next slide, please. Thank you. And obviously, children who are in military families, we just need to be aware of the additional stresses that they might have. So they are brilliant kids. They are often highly adaptable. They get used to lots of change. They are hugely loyal to the institution, often, as well as the parent. But that doesn't mean, obviously, they're not impacted. So common military child-related issue is mediation might include issues around school continuity, contact arrangements around deployment or irregular leave, emotional loyalty conflicts. There's a lot around I don't want to upset the serving parent because when they're away, I don't want them worrying about stuff that's going on at home. And one parent obviously carrying the full emotional and practical load during absences is, something as well we just need to take into account. And often the child might feel involved in supporting that parent as well. So, lots of different bits and pieces to think about. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. So just wanted to talk briefly about the deployment cycle, and I think this is sometimes helpful for us to understand. So the cycle of deployment, you can see on the slide here, but this is based on a model which was developed for naval families a long time ago by Kathleen Vestal, Logan, 1987. It's not that long ago, is it really? But some people might think it's quite a while ago, but certainly in my living memory. But it is a helpful way of understanding and explaining sort of the changes in feelings and behaviour that can result from deployment. And obviously, this is the case when the family is together, and then when the parents have separated, then this is still going to be impactful. So it's helpful to understand. this is kind of a standard model, and obviously there will be differences with individuals, but in general, if you look at the top sort of red bit, you can see that it says anticipation of loss. So often, and sometimes it happens quite a long time before this, but generally 4 to 6 weeks pre-deployment. As the departure date approaches, then you begin to feel sort of a sense of impending loss. Families become anxious, you could feel sad, suddenly, driven by the real reality of the separation. Then you sort of deal with detachment and withdrawal, which is the last few days pre-departure. So some family members might distance themselves, and that's quite a normal sort of reaction. So sort of everyone braces for the upcoming separation, and so you can have more arguments just before people go away. And obviously, the serving parent or personnel is involved in trying to get themselves ready for going away, as well as trying to spend as much time as they can with the last few days with the kids. Just after, so while you're at home, just after the serving personnel is gone, emotional disorganization is called. So feeling very emotional after they've left, feeling very unstable, very upset, very confused, and obviously the family's got to adjust to that. Then thinking as time goes on, get used to it, recovery and stabilization. So we get used to a new normal, and then they come home again. So 1 or 2 months before return, anticipation sort of, gets everyone gets excited. The parent is coming back. Again, confusing feelings for the if they're separated, for the parent who's at home looking after the children. Children suddenly wild with excitement that the other parents coming back. And then you get renegotiation. So they come back, and then you've got the early days after homecoming when you're trying to reintegrate into the family life, whatever it looks like, whether it's together or apart, and then trying to sort of renegotiate how it is, and then stabilization and reintegration kind of into normal life. So that's just a really quick summary of the emotional cycle of deployment. It's really helpful, I think, to understand it and understand how it relates to separated families as well. And then just remembering as well, it can also apply in a mini way to where there's weekending. So where somebody, the serving personnel is away, and they come back in at the weekends. So you can have a sort of like a mini cycle going on then as well. And then just the next slide, please. So just to finish off, I just wanted to mention this really fantastic website, which is Forces Children Scotland, where they have got kids to draw this most fantastic stuff about the emotional the deployment roller coaster, which is what they call the sort of how it feels to be in the deployment cycle. So do have a look at it. It's absolutely brilliant. And it gives you what it feels like to be a child who's involved in this sort of emotional roller coaster that deployment and other separated work-related separations bring into the family. Okay, that's it for me. So hopefully that's just a little bit of context. And now over to Karen.
Helen, thank you. I'm really struck here, I think, by these families and particularly the children being on this roller coaster. I mean, clearly we got some understanding there, and I've not had a chance to look at these resources, but these are children that have been used perhaps to a roller coaster, and then we
Mhm.
overlay that with what we know is the roller coaster of the emotions prior to and on separation. And so they are perhaps uniquely placed for a number of challenges, perhaps in
Yeah,
ways that other
yeah.
children and families are not.
I think the pressures are unique. And I think if you have a child with neurodivergence as well, then obviously the instability around that and separation is, can be really tough for both parents to handle. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I know you're going to add to the discussion as we progress, but what we thought we might do now, um, and Helen, we can take the slides off if that's okay, um, is to begin to look at perhaps some of the financial and practical considerations. What we're going to try and do in this fairly fast-moving discussion is to consider obviously a range of families. Some of these will be at the very start of the serving spouse's career, and some will be at the end of the of a military career. some where the income and resources are modest and where there may be debts, to very high net worth. And of course, we'll have to, as we should, touch on armed force pensions. But let's have a discussion, if I may, with Charlotte and Liam in terms of accommodation that may be provided as part of the lifestyle that someone who is in the military, the armed forces, might be provided. Liam, can you tell us what accommodation and housing might be provided, and therefore, if there is a separation, and I understand these families would need to be married in order to have married quarters, what the loss of that might look like and the practical implications of that?
Yes, of course. A lot of the families that we'll end up dealing with are going to be in service accommodation, the service family accommodation. And when a separation occurs, the first thing that's going to be on the serving personnel's mind is changing what they would refer to as their PSTAT, their personal status category, which is effectively notifying the forces that there is a change in their circumstances, that they're considering a separation. It's one of those things that does change from base to base. That some bases will take different approaches, so it is always worth having that conversation with them and seeing what is available to them as individuals. But a lot of the time, the bases might offer the serving personnel being able to move back into single accommodation, and sometimes they'll do that on a bit of a cooling off period as well. So if it's early on in the separation, they'll go, okay, let's just have a cooling off period for a little bit beforehand. But once that P stat has been changed, really the clock starts ticking. They have 93 days at that point to look at when they're effectively going to be having to move out of that service family accommodation. The serving personnel are often sorted to some extent at that stage because they've got their single living accommodation that they can stay in for as long as they need. You've then got the non-serving personnel that potentially are in quite a bit of difficulties at that point, and it becomes something that really needs to be thought quite quickly about because you have those 93 days and then they're potentially being kicked out. So you need to start looking at what alternatives are there, whether it's local authority housing at that point, because in theory they're potentially being made homeless at that stage, or whether there are other assets. A lot of these people have if they've been sensible with their finances, have gone off and got rental properties and things like that that they potentially have while they're then still living in the service accommodation. So it's trying to get a picture nice and early on, and then seeing what resources are available to everyone.
So I get a sense, perhaps for these families where accommodation is provided, that this, in some respects, may be the most pressing and immediate issue, particularly for the non-serving spouse, where the clock is ticking in terms then of their options. Charlotte, with these cases, do they have a welfare person to go to? Are they likely to know from neighbours and general chatter, and maybe there's a leaflet in a drawer somewhere? Will they know what to do and what their options are?
So again, the support varies in my experience. Some welfare officers are helpful, but the fact is that the serving person is the person who is going to be looked after first. And that can sometimes be extremely difficult, especially when there are children involved, because if you're not the serving person and you want the children to remain living with you, you need to be looking for somewhere that's going to be housing both yourself and your children. Liam's right that sometimes people may have invested in property, but if they've been moving around bases, that property may not be nearby. There may be difficulties with and needing to immediately relocate, and then obviously attendant school difficulties or changes that might be needed. And so it really is something that people need to be aware of and often are very aware of. And when we see people in mediation to begin with, that is often the thing that everybody wants to be discussing in the first place because it just is the most pressing.
Okay.
Sometimes it's useful as well to use the mediation to be able to sort of put heads together and try and work out how that's going to happen. Because again, in my experience, the serving person may well be, absolutely fine, but that doesn't necessarily abrogate them of their responsibility towards their the other parent and their children.
Have you come across circumstances where they might separate ordinarily if they had a greater range of options, but perhaps where they stay together because the accommodation need is going to be so acute and pressing, particularly for the non-serving spouse, particularly if that's, say, mum with young children and no independent career of her own?
I think it's definitely something that is thought about much earlier, possibly before the decision to separate has to be made. And as Liam says, there is this cooling off period, which I think gives a further about 93 days on top of the statutory 93. I think again, it depends on basis and how that's treated. But I think there can be an initial at some additional time. But it is very difficult, and putting heads together and trying to work that through together in a collaborative sort of way can be incredibly sensible, if that's possible.
Michael's made a comment. Thank you for this, Michael. In terms of then, obviously the clock is ticking. It is a court order and a possession order then required to evict the occupying spouse. That I absolutely don't know, but I can imagine these families have a sense of what their options are. They're in
Mm.
communities, presumably with other people, where they will have seen and such has happened to other people. But a roof over our head is a basic need. It's certainly a basic need in terms of any sort of normal family life. Um, and I really get a sense for this community, perhaps where there isn't any other option, there isn't an abundance of income to go and take a private rental necessarily, or family assistance, that this must create one of a number of of pressures, and particularly perhaps if the non-serving spouse has not followed their own career, built up their own income, etc.,
Mm.
etc., because they followed the serving spouse. Um,
And
yeah,
particularly, Karen, if it's not been their choice. And that can often
yes.
be, if they weren't the person who decided to end the relationship, that can often be a significant difficulty as well.
Whilst obviously there will be a certain amount of information and support, my sense of your sense, if I may, when we scoped this discussion, is that it is often felt that the support is there for the serving spouse, less so, and this may be a perception, but perceptions, as we know with our work, are really important, that the support is there for the serving spouse, not necessarily the other person.
I think my sense is that it very much that is very much how it can often feel, and that can then also lead into power imbalance in the negotiation positions or the starting points that both parties feel when they come to mediation as well. That one is very much feeling on the back foot and that things are happening to them that are very much out of their control, even if that may also be out of the control of the other person as well, because that is just how the system works. But again, it can be very difficult, particularly when that's not something that someone has chosen or position someone has chosen to be in.
Do you think when we look at obviously finances and children as two discrete issues, there is sometimes an overlap, um, that perhaps then the serving spouse feels, now I'm perhaps not in such a strong position here because of periods of deployment and other considerations. When we come to look at the practical arrangements in terms of child arrangements, which I am sure where mediation is safe and appropriate, what we offer these families is perhaps even better placed for them to consider the options. Could I ask each of you there what you and Helen helpfully touched on this, but the sort of creative approach that you've taken in mediation to try and put the best set of children arrangements around obviously the practical and geographical and deployment constraints for these families. Liam.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there with being creative with it. I think we've all seen court orders can be such a blunt instrument with it, and the very nature of military life, it has that unpredictability, and having something that is so rigid in place just doesn't suit those sort of circumstances. And so, what mediation provides is that format to be a little bit more creative with your solutions, which for these sort of families is exactly what they need. If someone's going to be thrown on a deployment and not be there for 3 6 months, those arrangements need to suddenly be able to be fluid, and whether that's then okay an interim discussion in the mediation of what we're going to do short term now that you're on deployment, or whether it's having a longer term discussion of okay, if deployment happens in the future, how are we going to then approach it at that stage.
Charlotte, any particular approaches that you've taken, perhaps in mediation, that have considered the practical arrangements? Of course, for all families, we operate under the Children Act. We don't have an order unless it would be better to have an order than not. Parents coming to their own arrangements tend to endure and work better for them. But have there been any particular considerations or approaches that you've taken when considering children arrangements?
I think the circumstances are often very well known to the family and to both parents, and it's been their lived reality that the children have maybe seen one parent less or serving parent less. But equally, things like weekending can sometimes cause difficulties, because if that's the only time that the parent is at home, that's often seen as the sort of, the good quality time. But if that's the only time that's around, then sometimes sharing that can be tricky. And again, it's just about continuing to discuss, communicate, keep those options open to allow both of the parents to think about, given this circumstance, how are they going to work things out for the best for their children, given that the roles when they were together and that was the situation may well be completely different now that they are no longer together.
It can be helpful, can't it? Sometimes in mediation, we have to be careful when we ask a couple this, but tell me how you managed that when you were together. If one of them works on an oil rig somewhere, they have been used to living a certain life.
Yes.
And I mean, if they then say, well, it never worked, so we don't have any base plate from which to work, but actually asking how they managed this in family life before can be helpful in terms of the past, possibly an indicator as to the future. For you, Helen, have there been any particular techniques, questions, additional resources when putting children arrangements together that you have found have helped these families for us to consider?
Well, I think when you were talking, what I was really thinking of is that sometimes, obviously, if the serving personnel is now not living with the children and will be living in service accommodation, but is living by themselves, is that the military will then provide special houses and things for them to have the visits of the children in. And actually, so I'm not completely answering your question, but I was thinking about how challenging that can be for the children to be going to a house that they don't really know, to try and have fun in, for the, say, stereotypically dad to have the children in and to have fun in this completely sort of empty, sort of, slightly difficult, not really their home. So I think that's just something extra just to bear in mind, is how that works and what that might feel like. I've got some resources at the end of the slideshow that we could have another look at, that I really recommend. So that I'll come back to those, Karen.
Thank you.
I think, Karen, one thing I've found that has been really helpful is the ability to reality test and to really think about, okay, well, if whatever's being suggested, how might that work? What is that going to look like? And being able to work it through, because the parents will generally want their children to have fun, to have a nice time. But to work through what that's actually going to look like, because if one parent isn't there, or one parent isn't there for a long period of time, how are we going to rebuild that relationship when they don't just come back into the home? They may go back into, separate place, separate property. But again, there's still been that period of separation. So how are we going to move that along?
So using the same techniques, being
Mm,
curious, the mediator, do no harm. How did
mm,
it work for your family before? How might it work now? Always putting the child's needs above everything else, but some, gentle and kind, supportive reality
mm,
checking in terms of what can be done. For those children, perhaps for more senior personnel that are away at boarding school, Liam, may I ask you some of the particular considerations there for those children?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, there, if children are off at the boarding schools and things like that, which is often provided to them when someone is on deployment quite regularly, and so they've thought, okay, let's try to avoid the changing schools and that side of things, and so the boarding school route has made perfect sense to them at that point. There is sometimes an additional consideration at this point with if they've been using what they refer to as the continued educational allowance, which is a subsidy that's given to the personnel to assist with those costs. But in the event of a separation, if there is a change of who those children are living with, then actually, if they're not living as a primary carer with the person that's serving still, actually they can lose the entitlement to those subsidies. And so suddenly, not only have you got everything else that's going on to consider, a lot of the time people are arguing that it makes sense for them to live with the non-serving personnel because they're not going to be on deployment. But you've suddenly then got another financial consideration of, well, okay, if that's going to happen, are we still going to be able to be keeping at the boarding school? Is that option still going to be left to them because suddenly you've not got that financial support?
mm,
A lot of the time there is a cooling off period again with if it's around certain times of the with the kids, certain exams, those sort of things, there will be a little bit of a leeway. But suddenly they've got again a short period of time to start thinking about, okay, have we now also suddenly got to start thinking about a change in schooling, or can we come up with a creative arrangement where actually primary care is still staying with the serving personnel so that those subsidies are still available to them?
mm,
So it is, I suppose, in just as we do with our work, we hear from our clients, tell me what's important to you, what are our guiding objectives and principles. And I suppose just as we do on Civvy Street, where parents may say keeping our children in their fee earning schools, okay, that's going to be a financial stretch. Well, we don't mind actually if we both downsize, if we're sort of almost living under the arches. For us, this is our absolute priority. And again, with these families, identifying what is your guiding objective and principle and where they are aligned. Of course, we know as mediators that makes our role that much easier. Wherefore, parents, they say, actually, just started 2 years GCSEs, don't want to move of school. What is it you can do in mediation to say, okay, entirely understandable, you appear now to be seeking, there are common objectives here. What might we do in terms of either how this is expressed, approached, etc.? Of course, not wanting to go anywhere near the court for child arrangements unless you absolutely have to. But what have some of the novel and practical ways been in mediation that you have approached this particular issue? And I don't mind if Helen or Charlotte, either of you have approached this in terms of the school fees, boarding school element, in terms of, as I understand it, um, if, for example, there was a court order and a lives with mum, for example, one can't hide behind an order. And my sense from our discussions is that that would need to be made known. And of course, that could then have the impact after the cooling period of a significant change in school provision. What have you been able to do
mm.
in mediation where you've identified that seeking to keep children in their schools has actually been a common objective of both parents, and then put the child arrangements around that to seek to achieve that?
If I just say a couple of sentences, then I'll hand over to you, Charlotte. So I'm panicking, Karen, at the thought of anything novel or anything amazing that I can come up with. But definitely, I think it probably depends on liaising with the base that they're on and the local office, and working out what's allowed and what isn't, and then trying to work around that and trying to make it happen.
Mm.
That's as far as I've got. So it's like Liam was saying, no, it's very local, isn't it? It can be different depending on which base they're on and what have you. But I'm
Yes.
going to pass over to Charlotte now.
Thank you, Helen.
Yes.
So yeah, I suppose again using the options that are available to us always in mediation, with doing a parenting plan that is more flexible, that doesn't necessarily define rigidly it, exactly what in the way with a court order where it would need to be stated exactly that there was a lives with or whatever, with a parenting plan, careful drafting, so that was so it was clear exactly what the parents intended and exactly what the arrangements were going to be. But I think it's also important to consider the other resources that may be available to the serving parent in terms of wraparound care and other resources and benefits that there might be to be able to facilitate them having that time with the children, so that it's not just oh well, you're the serving parent, so therefore you can't possibly have the children for any length of time because you might be deployed or you might be this. Well, actually, there are circumstances when, with the appropriate wraparound care which is available on base, with the appropriate support that is available on base, actually there can be a very successful arrangement for a child to be staying with the serving parent, and it's not something that the door should be shut on automatically because they may be going on deployment. So again, it's just about being flexible.
That's a really good point. And I suppose that nicely leads us in to maintenance and child maintenance considerations. And again, as we would with any of our clients, trying to assist a separating couple to come to their own arrangements. One of the things that I've become aware of in a case, and I have nowhere near the experience that any of you have in this space, is that sometimes there's a provision to the serving spouse in terms of accommodation. And of course, that might artificially depress their income for the purpose of a child maintenance calculation, for example. So I suppose just as we would with any family, would you, particularly for a military family, try to negotiate their child maintenance, possibly spousal maintenance? There's a point I'd like to come to there about keeping spousal maintenance open, at least to the level to bring it up to the child maintenance that there would have been, but for the deduction of income because the accommodation is provided. But again, is there anything particular for this community that you would consider when considering their overall global maintenance discussions in mediation and child maintenance? Liam, may I ask you?
I think it works both ways as well, because on the other hand, you also can quite often find that you have the opposite issue in that if someone has been deployed within the last 12 months, their income will often increase with that as well. And sadly, often you see these sort of separations happening after they've come back from a deployment. And so if they are sent off to child maintenance calculation, we all know that can be, again, very rigid. And so they are off your income for the last 12 months with this. And so that is your calculation. And they are suddenly stuck with that. So it is a big emphasis on actually, if you can all come to some sort of consensus in the mediation process, yes, it might be using online CMS calculator, but being creative again with that, in that actually income isn't necessarily what it says on the paperwork that we've had over the last 12 months. And allowing everyone to recognize that during the process so that it can be a more accurate calculation than, unfortunately, being sent off to third parties making the decision for them, which we all know can often end pretty badly.
That's a really good point that
Mm.
actually, of course, in all our cases, if we are, for example, working off the last P60, that may be artificially high and it may be artificially suppressed because accommodation is provided and perhaps other benefits are provided. Um, and a supported conversation to say, well, look, let's look at where we are now, the ground under our feet, what there is, what you need, etc. It's got to be the better way
Mm.
to try and approach it. Anything that you would
Mm.
add to that, Charlotte?
Only just that in my experience, with some of the military families, you're into universal credit territory for one of the parties, and then obviously anything that is not child maintenance but is spousal maintenance is reduced on reduces pound for pound any universal credit calculation. So just again considering, what are we calling it? What is it? What payments are being made? And might be needed in those circumstances.
Thank you. Let's touch on pensions. This is not a military pensions advanced practitioners seminar. Um, I think all of us that do this work, whether as lawyers, mediators, or other professionals, armed forces pensions, or crikey, don't dabble, specialist area, etc. My understanding, and obviously, I think we have to accept that somebody might go into the army at 18 um, and be looking to sort of come out at 48, is that this really is a specialist area. I thought so that I didn't appear like a total dummy in this space. Get both copies of PAG 1 and PAG 2 out and remind myself, and it is in the slides, that probably going to the pensions on divorce guides is a really good place to start. But what are some of the considerations for our mediation community here in terms of armed forces pensions, and particularly where we are in getting CEVs? Liam, may I come to you because I know that this is a speciality of yours.
Yeah, of course. I think the starting point is to really try and get your head around what benefits are available to the parties. There are so many different nuances to the military pensions, not just whether what the standard cash accrual value is, but whether they're in receipt of the EDP payments, whether they are under war pensions, ill health pensions. That there are so many that until you start getting into the actual detail of them, you are totally blind. And so obviously your starting point is to get those cash equivalent values applied for. Sadly, at the moment, you're then sat twiddling your thumbs for a little while, waiting for Veterans UK to provide that sort of information, which doesn't help then while you've got the pressing issues of accommodation and everything else on top of that, which does mean sometimes you are having to park pension discussions while everything else is still progressing and having those conversations in the meantime. But it is then, yeah, really important that you get down to the finite detail of what all of these pension benefits are, if they're already in receipt of them, what are they actually in receipt of? Is a pension sharing order going to have an effect on them, depending on the type of benefits that they're receiving? Some will be affected by a pension sharing order, some won't be. Also understanding what pension sharing orders can actually be made against, in that there are some pension benefits that'll be in receipt that a pension sharing order cannot touch. And so you've then got to start considering, are you accounting for that elsewhere? Are you taking more of an offsetting approach or sharing more of a shareable asset? But yeah, it all comes down to that information stage right at the start to really understand just for yourself, not just the parties involved. And a lot of the time, if it's a non-serving party as well, they're going to have fairly little knowledge of what is being talked about as well, which is always helpful in terms of you can play a little bit dumb and ask, actually, I need this explained to me just as much as anyone else here. But yeah, it all starts getting down to that detail right to begin with.
My sense, well, not my sense, for those cases that I have conducted, this really does appear to me to be a specialist area. War pensions for injuries cannot be subject to a pension sharing order. Early departure payments not subject to a pension sharing order. It must feel possibly in mediation, unless the mediator is, as you're saying, being very even-handed in, oh, cracky, I haven't quite understood that. Could you tell me again? That to the non-serving person, this does run the risk possibly of sort of going over their head. You're having a conversation with the serving spouse that you and they both sort of understand, and the other person is feeling perhaps a little sidelined and in the dark.
Mm.
Anything that you would add to that,
Yeah.
Charlotte?
Just a couple of things, Karen. One, going back to the imbalance of power and imbalance of knowledge, I think sometimes, in my experience, or in one of the cases I was mediating, the non-serving spouse was very fixated, I suppose, about what she was entitled to because of having spoken to other people who'd been in that position. And I think talking back to the sense of community, where you may be speaking to people who are in a similar situation with similar military pensions. She wasn't struggled to understand that every case needed to be determined on its own individual facts and situations rather than just a one size fits all. So that was one comment. And then the other was just to say, and again, we spoke about it in the scoping meeting, about how protective some people can feel over what is we all know is a marital asset, but when it is accumulated doing a job that is serving your country and putting yourself in harm's way, there can then be more of an attachment to that asset. Although it was quite interesting because I was reading on the gov.uk website some of the guidance, and they were talking about how the military pension is is structured in the way that it is because of the family sacrifice that is made by military families. And it is, and as we've spoken, Helen particularly has spoken about how the differences and how your life isn't necessarily your own, and there are higher forces that will tell you where to go, when to go, how to go, and the impact that then has on your children as well. I thought that was quite an interesting take on it that I would definitely be using going
Yes,
forward as a sort of offset of that. Well, this is my pension, I've earned it.
it is, because we obviously, self-interest is a very powerful thing. People can feel
Mm,
entirely, wedded to their assets and pensions. And as we know from the Fair Shares report, that sometimes people can, and this I think is predominantly wives, not have their fair shake, and sometimes feel, well, they've earned it, it's theirs. And I wonder whether in this community there is even more of a sense of that. And isn't that interesting that the language on the gov.uk, which is in the resources here,
mm,
is sort of creating a
mm.
different setting for that. Helen,
Yeah.
did you want to say
No, I
something?
just wanted to say, Charlotte, that's a brilliant tip. Thank you very
Yes,
much.
brilliant.
Yeah, we'll
Perhaps
all be
we'll all
using
do it.
that.
We'll do a reading of those words, because of
Mm,
course
Yeah.
how we say it, how it lands,
mm,
it is really important. One of the things in preparing for this, and of course we touched on it in terms of who is considered to be a veteran, which I didn't know, is that someone, if they've served one day,
Mm,
is considered to
mm,
be a veteran. And we think there are 2.35 million veterans in the country. Is that, and this has come up anecdotally with somebody I know, that they've had an ongoing health issue, and actually by virtue of a very, very short
mm,
stint in the forces, they're now entitled to a proper military medical investigation into whatever it is that may be ailing them, which may not be related to their period of
mm,
service. So one day
mm,
can,
mm.
give
It's
rise to a
enough.
whole
Mm,
array of benefits, which I had absolutely no idea about
mm,
until
mm,
sort of getting further into this. Um, could we touch on suitability or not of mediation? And I suppose is for
mm.
please let's make it a sort of four-way conversation. We've touched on different areas of where perhaps our offering can be particularly helpful for these families. Where might it not be, or what other particular considerations should we have as mediators?
There's always the safeguarding aspect that we've got to go through, in the MIAM and see what that relationship was like. And there are again, anecdotally, I'm not sure if there's any evidence but there's a lot of, or seems to be, domestic abuse, which is not necessarily more prevalent or less prevalent, but just a feature that we always need to be mindful of. Um, but again, I'm not that's not necessarily something that is unique to military families.
Helpful to have Helen's graphic of
Hmm.
the cycle.
Mm,
We as mediators, we Kubler-Ross, the grief cycle. We like a we. I think it helps us to see things in terms of
mm,
stages to understand.
mm,
And that's something I'm really going to bear in mind in terms of
mm,
where is this family
Mm.
mm,
in this cycle of their lives, and perhaps for us to think about as we do, of course, emotional readiness, timing. Um, are they both at a point when they can then meaningfully engage? Is there so much else going on? We're on 92 days of our 93 days, and actually having an awareness of their lives on a practical and sort of cyclical sense, if I may say, I think is a particular consideration as to
mm,
when it may be appropriate to mediate and when it may not be.
mm,
Liam, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think one thing to pick up on as well is also the practical arrangements of the mediation itself as well. In that, quite often in these sort of circumstances, you might be dealing with one party that is overseas, and is potentially overseas doing quite a stressful job. And they might be very keen to engage in that mediation process, but actually, we've always got to have in our back of mind of whether they are going to be in the right headspace to be mediating. You've already got the additional considerations of the fact that it's potentially going to be remote mediation at that point, and so you've not got them all in the room with you. And then suddenly you've also got someone that might not be in a comfortable place, both physically and mentally, to be able to actually engage with the mediation properly.
Yeah, I think, and Wi-Fi is a big issue. It's not always there, doesn't always work, can't always access it depending on what's going on. And I think, again, like Liam said, tiredness. So if you've been on the submarines, then you do 6 hours on, 6 hours off, 6 hours on, 6 hours off, the whole of your 8 month period on deployment, for example. So you never get a sort of decent sleep. And, so you can be, like Liam said, it's quite a stressful position to be in.
I think we would
mm,
consider our process
mm,
flexible where
Mm,
it's
mm,
appropriate. There must be some circumstances where security is an issue, and actually just getting connectivity
mm,
and identifying where people are geographically, etc.,
mm,
must also be an additional
mm.
consideration in some circumstances.
Yeah. And the availability and access to information. If you're away abroad on deployment, that piece of paper that is just in your filing cabinet at home is not going to be very accessible to you when you're away. So I think it's all just about planning and taking all these things into account and working out whether, it may be that it's not suitable as a result of um, deployment. But equally, when you think, well, the court's not going to be able to make any progress either if
mm.
there's that that issue. So actually, is it worth waiting and giving this process an opportunity to be successful as well?
And considering the person on deployment, where you leave them. We, of course, then
Mm,
close our screen, take care of yourself, etc.
Mm.
What's their aftercare? What are they then doing?
mm,
What are they running off to, etc. Just as we do consider our clients and the care and the aftercare and the setting in which we leave them. We have 5 minutes left. I would like Helen, Anthony, if you'd be so kind to
Yeah.
put the slides up, and Helen, could you just take us through some of the signposting and other resources there for further
Yeah.
reading?
Yeah, lovely. Brilliant. So if you just don't mind going down a couple of slides when you're ready. That's it, lovely. So this is just again, the last few slides are just around some extra resources. So just signposting where you can send your clients for additional help. Like I think it was I can't remember which one of you mentioned earlier, but if you've been part of the military family, even just for one day, there is a wealth of charitable support out there that is available and government funded support. So you might want to think about some of these depending on which type of, what they've been involved in the Navy or the Army. So the Confederation of Service Charities, if you look there, it's got a list of virtually every single charity that exists to support military families. So have a look there. There's masses of help out there for mental health, financial issues. I mean, there's just masses of stuff, gambling, addictions, masses and masses of stuff. RNRMC, which is the Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity, has a huge offer of support, and actually they fund Southampton Family Trust, which is the charity that I work at. And so they've given us masses of funding to help support families where there's children with neurodivergence. So again, loads of resources available. So yeah, just have a look through there. So they're all useful, all worth trying. If you just pop onto the next slide. And all of these three things that I've listed here, if you want to know what it feels like to be in the military community, read these. They're absolutely brilliant. They're all relatively recent. Living in our shoes they're just superb. It tells you masses and masses of information of what it really feels like to be in a military family. And then there's the next slide. Thank you. And then if you want some more extra reading, all of these here, I think sometimes military pensions, do not be afraid. There is more information out about how a military pension is divided and what they do than almost any other pension. So all of these here, absolutely fantastic. If you want to read about the pension that you are dealing with your clients, they'll give you lots of information here. So yeah, and that's that, I think.
Thank you. And we can take the slides down. I'm putting here, I hope I am, a link. I hope that's come up, the Equal Treatment Bench Book. I wasn't aware of this, and this is a book for those who sit on tribunals and judiciary, etc. What a best kept resource and best kept secret. It although it is obviously intended to assist those who are assisting people at court, it's full of all sorts of information on different communities, needs, people with disabilities. There is a veterans section in there at page 91. Inclusivity, diversity, etc. As I say, 2.35 million veterans. The Royal British Legion is currently undertaking a consultation as to whether the Office of National Statistics is going to continue to gather information on the number of veterans. Aftercare, obviously, we haven't got so much into that space, but we often hear, don't we, that our veterans, perhaps after a career of giving and in service, are perhaps not so well looked after. One of the consultations is that data in terms of who these people are might stop being gathered, and the Royal British Legion is saying that would be entirely the wrong thing to do, because we're not going to be able to get the data on that community, and we're going to sort of touch with them. I commend the Equal Treatment Bench Book to you generally as a lawyer or a mediator. You're bound to find it full of all sorts of rich information, and as I say, it has a small section on veterans. We are 1 minute away from our finish time. I haven't seen any further questions come up, and that's probably because in our 59 minutes we've covered absolutely everything. We've whetted your appetite in terms of where to go for further information. I hope we have. I think, as we do with all our clients, we can't stand in their shoes, but we can try and do our best to have a better understanding of the challenges that they are facing. And we hope that this webinar has been helpful to you when these cases come to you. And if perhaps there are, as our esteemed experts here, people that are perhaps better placed to deal with the unique challenges of these families, then please obviously refer your cases on. Louisa, thank you for your comment. It was really interesting. Thank you. And I think at exactly the hour I shall bring us to a conclusion. May I thank Helen, Anthony, and the staff team from behind the scenes with Family Mediation Week generally, and for so smoothly working the slides today. Thank you for your time.
Very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.